So the title of this panel is Ethical Cannabis, Harm Reduction and Drug Policy Reform. And it really is a very complex topic, and I think probably one of the more important topics to look at within the wider cannabis space right now. And just as for the sake of the semantic issue that we have been facing at the symposium, when I say cannabis, I very much intended to mean all practices around cannabis. And within that, understanding where ethics falls in, how harm reduction is being misapplied but can also be correctly applied to cannabis spaces, and how this is integral to drug policy reform. So when I met with three of my panelists previously to discuss this topic, one of the biggest difficulties we faced was defining ethical cannabis. And I thought today we can actually just start off with that, particularly because we have Gernot from the academic background with his work in Cannabis Africana as well. He's probably one of my favorite nerds in the cannabis space right now. And then, of course, we have Hilton-Barber, who has his background in reporting on cannabis matters in South Africa as well as internationally. He's been doing that for a very long time as his own project. Then Pedro, who have the bioethics and educational background. And then we have Pollack from Harambe Solutions, who also has a legal background. But something that's very important to me about Brett being on this panel is also because of the work that you are doing through the Mpondoland Plug project and what that also means for bringing ethics into the practices of cannabis. So yeah, we can just kind of go in a row, and if you can define the ethics of cannabis relative to your field.
Is that me? Okay, so thanks a lot, Leela. Very difficult panel because we are not really sure what we are talking about in a way. So I think we hopefully find out through our conversation what ethical cannabis actually means, because I think it means many different things to many different people. So I'm an academic. I work at the University of Bristol, where I headed a project on Cannabis Africana, which looked at cannabis and the roles it plays in people's lives over the last. The project was a 4-year project, looked at Zimbabwe, South Africa, Kenya, and Nigeria. And most of my research is mostly on Nigeria. So when I talk about cannabis, I talk mostly about southwestern Nigeria. But as an academic, we are sort of bound by certain ethical standards. You know, we have ethics reviews, and it sounds sometimes ridiculous when I tell you how long it takes us to prepare our research, our ethics reviews. For this project, it was actually quite straightforward. It probably took about half a year, but for some projects I've done 1.5 years ethics preparations, because what we want to do is that our research is ethical, and that means for us researchers it shouldn't do harm to the people that we work with, so it shouldn't harm participants essentially. But in an ideal world, there should, research should only do good, should benefit society, should benefit researchers, participants. But in reality, often these harms, they cannot be taken away completely, I think. And maybe that's something important for the cannabis industry as well. As researchers, we know that we can try to reduce some of the harms, but they will never completely go away. So what we use is a kind of technique of thinking about our research and how we could potentially reduce some of those harms that it causes. So in terms of research, your harm could be like, I use my participants to extract information just for me to get benefit, to publish something. One thing we also do is we try to keep the identities of our participants hidden or confidential, but so that they wouldn't, like in Nigeria, where cannabis is completely illegal and there's 15 years for a simple possession of cannabis as a sort of a penalty. I would never want my informants, their identities to be known, especially not for law enforcement. But sometimes these measures we have to reduce harms can actually cause harms, because my participants actually want to be known. They want their names to be mentioned in my research. I say I can't do that, So it's in a way, because they feel they are being stigmatized even more because I hide their identities, because they want to be known. But in the current Nigerian framework, so this is always a negotiation. Anyway, so the idea of research ethics is essentially we try to keep the harms from research as minimal as possible with the knowledge that we cannot completely eliminate them, but we strive to reduce them as much as possible. And I think that's the last point I want to make. There's a link to the cannabis industry. I think we know that the cannabis industry potentially can create harms. We can think about those potential harms, thinking about excluding certain sections from the cannabis industry, for example, but we can strive, I guess, you guys know much better, can strive to be less harmful than it could potentially be. So a very vague answer, but hopefully there's a link to the cannabis industry.
So coming from a media space, it reminds me of a tabloid editor when he was asked about what he thought of ethics. He said, "What, that place in southern England?" And I think that in many ways the whole concept of ethics should have been a foundational starting point for before we even started talking about laws and regulations around the cannabis industry. That's why I think this sort of back to basics conversation is very important, because if we started with an ethical framework and not just a cut and paste from a first world sort of experimental case, we wouldn't have the situation that we have today with indigenous farmers, the intended beneficiaries of cannabis reform, being actually on the real short end of the stick and being victimized and criminalized for something that's, for all intents and purposes, government has the opposite intention for them. And I think that situation has come about precisely because there's no honest discussion at the beginning of this whole process. The ethical discussion was around the Concord ruling, and then the parallel process developed around the National Cannabis Master Plan. So we've had these different strands of reform development that are in silos, that don't speak to each other, and that the whole situation has become very, very fragmented because it lacks any kind of ethical foundation. So there is no morality in the industry. Everything is transactional. It's all relying on people's reputations or what they go by. But in the absence of, never mind rules and regulations, but an ethical starting point, we're going to have to do, I think, Ricky's term from Ricky Service term earlier. So how do we retrofit regulations for something that's already been created? It's like the horse is bolted.
Yeah.
And it's a fine time to be starting to talk about ethics now, but it's like planting a tree. I mean, the best time to have planted it was 30 years ago. The next best time is now.
Yeah, it's like transplanting it with the roots cut off.
It's been a completely overlooked conversation. I don't really know where it actually starts, given that there isn't really a great history from the government or from the ANC's part in negotiating seriously on scale. But there is no ethical agreement that you have in terms of, and it goes beyond morality, because morality is its own thing altogether. Yeah, that's my advice.
Nico?
All right. Well, thank you all for welcoming me around here. I'm from Brazil, and I come from the background of studying bioethics at the university, so I have a master's degree in bioethics. So we exercitate a little bit the concept, right, and try to stretch it and concise it, and actually it comes from a place where it looked as a science. It's an applied science because it looks for solutions. When you study ethics, it looks like very abstract or something, but actually you're actually looking for solutions for decision making while you're having to make some decision. Bioethics comes up as a very important discipline by the 90s, when the clinicians had to decide whether they should operate somebody or not operate somebody, or take somebody's will into consideration while doing some kind of procedure like euthanasia. Sorry.
Assisted death.
Yeah, assisted death. Sorry, my English. I've 10 years I've lived in California. I still have the accent, but the vocabulary is missing. So sometimes I just laugh off.
Don't worry, after the
Your English is better than ours.
Then our Spanish.
Okay. Make me understand, right? So, if anything. Anyways, bioethics and its concept, right? So it was very useful for clinicians to make these practical decisions. And then there was a major global push to make it so that it would be a uniform thing that everybody would obey this ethical substrate beyond any local legislation, right? And which gives substrate for the legislations itself, so that like clinicians could follow anywhere. So that made it so that it came up a ethical based decision making principles that were made by also very much thought on the North American way of thinking, individualist, very capitalist oriented, and very individualistic oriented, which would be held by four basic principles that clinicians would say, hey, this principle or this other one, and autonomy was the most important principle besides equity, besides equality. So autonomy would always wins. And that applied generally over the world, caused so many problems that would surge and invoke another concept of ethics that would be based on culturally diverse constructions, which are way more interesting anyways, because ethics are not made to be universal. They are culturally conditioned. So it means that something ethical to my people, my tribe, wouldn't be the same, understand the same way as other people's, others' tribe, others' way of thinking. And that should be taken into consideration because we're a multi-diverse society. Something that the plant also teaches us, the value of the diversity, the richness of it. So that surged a whole new series of developments that also come across the way that we do research and the way that we have to deal with that because of so many badly made researches that actually separated really more the gap and the difference between people than approximated people. So that, for example, there is a very interesting tool I may talk later if you guys are interested to defend this ethics globally that the UN surge, which is called the Declaration of Bioethics and Human Rights. And there's a bunch of different articles there that we can use to make our point in several different spaces in cannabis, like non-stigmatization. Anything that goes stigmatizing any social group is against the ethics. So, and it's globally accepted and signed for the 154 whatever countries that are in the UN. So that's a practical tool that we can use. And another one of them is the recompensation. I don't know if it's a word. The reward. I don't know if that's a word. We're actually for people that do these kinds of trials. Like, for instance, participate in a clinician trial with cannabis. So they have to be recompensated, not with appearance, of course, because that is against the anonymity, against the exposure of data. But with the technology that comes out of this research, they should benefit. That population should be benefit with that technology. So that's a compromise each and every company should make when they're making any clinician study. So this is a little bit tackle on bioethics, on the definition of ethics. And I came to cross bioethics, which is a very small camp or area of research in this science all over the world because I've came across to develop interdisciplinary studies to empower non-industrial producers of cannabis. Because there is a battle, there is a dispute between what's legitimate as a medicinal use as for the products and the logic followed by the pharmacies industry and for the local producing full extract, culturally based cannabis use that is usually non-legitimized by most legalization processes. And the way it is important to think all of this as one is that legislations change, but morality and ethical values change very much slower and has a different pace than the law. So it's very important, of course, thinking of this is so important to speak of because of that, and also that links and connections with education, because we need to talk about this each time more and more, not only in our little spaces, in our circles, but to get it out there as a discipline, as a practical way of thinking life and making decisions, so that we're not only based and guided by the legislations, which are always behind us, right? So that's the contribution that I intend to make.
Right. Thank you.
Basically, just depart from exactly your premise, which is, I think, like, even as a lawyer, we hyperfixate on what's legal and what's not legal, and how we're going to shove this plant in the right box. And in as much as that is what maybe the greatest challenge that we face as lawyers and as a community, but I think the harder challenge is to put forward what type of cannabis culture are we pushing. And I think that, like, to answer it from an ethical basis, we need to depart, I guess, from the premise that this plant is deeply a part of us when we're born already, but each of our systems are very different from each other's. And so what that means is, not necessarily, obviously the fight against prohibition is incredibly important, and the prohibitionist agenda that this plant is harmful is ridiculous, and we need to constantly fight against that destigmatization. But I'm just not necessarily sure that the opposite of prohibition is unbridled commercialization. And I think that, like, looking at that from a lens which kind of can maybe envisage that maybe unbridled commercialization is just going to produce and perpetuate a culture of getting blasted, instead of a culture that, like, really is sensitive to each of our cannabinoid systems individually and creating, like, a culture of care and support, I think needs to be the premise that we move from, and understanding. So for me, in a word, it's culture. Actually the human relationship with the human inside of themselves and in community. I guess just challenging the notion of a value chain that is there to extract value, because if we allow ourselves to adopt just high THC products, largely maybe an American kind of inheritance that we got, instead of understanding full spectrum kind of impact and health, and the ability to actually use the plants during our ordinary activities. We understand that here, but largely the beyond the intimate community, I think the view is that cannabis and cannabis will always, I think, remain at the margins from an ethical perspective. If that's the dominant culture, if we're allowing the incentive to produce and create economy of scale, and how do we put that into a law instead of focusing on kind of what are the needs? That because cannabis, I believe we all need cannabis. That's my deep belief, but we all need it in a very different way. So I think, like, the greatest challenge for me is to avoid the harms that will come with an unbridled, legalized, commercialized situation, because that's going to put all the power, it's going to concentrate all the power in capital, and it's going to continue to push the cheapest product with the highest amount of THC instead of, like, individuated needs of each of us that desperately, in my opinion at least, need cannabis for a healthy life. So for me, that's where the conversation, like, as much as I'm a lawyer and as much as, clients ask how do I make what I'm doing legal, I'm actually a bit tired of that conversation. I think we need to start from the premise of culture.
Yeah, I think it's important to also acknowledge that ethics are culturally constructed. As has been mentioned, the ethics of one culture cannot be matched with another. We do have certain inherent qualities as humans, and I think finding that again is also really important, especially at a time where the world is becoming more schismatized by different political ideologies that are ripping us apart. For myself, I would actually like to call out the ethical faux pas of this panel, and that it is very white and, male within the African context. We have gross underrepresentation of our legacy market, our original custodians at events like this. And this perpetuates the othering that we are seeing being bolstered by the commercial side of this market. We keep having this idea that it's a sunrise sector or it's something that's now coming into being. That's nonsense. We are trying to formalize an existing market, and we have very divergent ideas on how this needs to be done. And we have an inability to see our own fault in that. So therein, I actually want to focus a little bit on the ethics of hope. The hope that we are creating in this space by the way that we are marketing the lucrative potential of this plant while denying the rights of the original custodians of this plant. How do we get around that, and how do the different areas that you represent play into contributing toward that? Or at least dispelling it?
Shall I start again? It's tough to start first,
You can change seats.
Oh, no, it's a good excuse if I say rubbish. Anyway, but I think I really agree, Leela, our panel, this conference maybe is a reflection of, in a way, these power dynamics going on, so the dominance of white Europe. I mean, me as a European-based researcher at the European University doing research on an African or West African cannabis market, why is that the case? I do work with West African colleagues. That's another ethical dimension of our research. We can't just go in there and say, I need to know about cannabis markets in Nigeria, give me the information. I work with Nigerian partners, and over long times we build trust and things like that. But still, our research, our business is reflective of these power structures in society. And I'm not surprised that probably the South African cannabis industry is reflective, the current one, of the more powerful actors within the market, which are often corporations, and these traditionally powerful actors. Anyway, so the question was about hope. I mean, maybe I wanted to just say a little bit about Nigeria. Maybe it links to the ethics of hope a little bit, because you don't hear much about Nigeria. The interesting thing, so we work with farmers in Nigeria, illicit farmers, it's all illicit, or even though in some communities it's completely accepted, they say we have legalization, we don't need your stuff, your ideas about legalization. But it's actually this illicit cannabis that provides livelihoods for people, like it used to be probably in Pondoland before changes, or maybe still nowadays. People that didn't have access to legal markets, that lacked the skills, they lacked the connections. In Nigeria, you need a lot of connections to succeed in business. They used cannabis as a way to make a living. Some people got successful, made a lot of money, basically, if they were lucky. And so when we ask them, actually, would you want liberalization or legalization of cannabis? They are very, very reluctant, actually. They sometimes say, they are very tuned into everything that's happening here. They know what's happening in Zimbabwe, in Ghana, and other places. And they actually know that, we only want a kind of legalization or liberalization that's on our terms, essentially. So we don't want the corporations, because we know the corporations from the cocoa business, they buy our cocoa that gets then shipped to Europe, not transformed into chocolate and sold back to us. We don't want these kind of extractive relationships. They're also very worried about the state, because as soon as you start legalizing, at the moment you face the police, they're very brutal, but you can bribe them, you can sort of settle them to some degree. Whereas then later on, you worry about paying taxes, and that's a very extractive kind of relationship. Why would you need to
bribe them?
Sorry?
Why would you need to bribe them if it's legalized to drink it?
No, sorry.
To bribe the police, you say?
At the moment it's not legalized, but if it were legalized.
Well, that's what I mean. You can't say that. It can't be legal or illegal. And that's
it's your point about the human practice. I get your point. Okay, so the exchange of cannabis is illegal at the moment.
Without license, authority, or exemption.
Yeah, but still people make it work for them because they have a relationship with the police or with law enforcement.
Sure.
So in a way we call it quasi-legal. You can sort of negotiate these kind of relationships. But it's a good thing. So people don't actually want to move to a different system because they know the current system, so and they worry about what's happening here. So I actually thought, what's ethical cannabis? And that's related to the hope. People have hope in these communities. They want also the police not to come in and crack down on their farms and these kind of things. They want they call it freedom, basically. They want the freedom from state intervention. But I think it can only be ethical cannabis, I think, in these kind of contexts, if the harms that those farmers we work with face can be eliminated. And these are the harms from law enforcement, cracking down on them. It is the harms actually being within a very extractive economy. I don't know if that's the same in South Africa, whereas, Nigerian economy is set up as a very extractive thing. It has colonial roots, oil is produced and then shipped abroad, and some people make a lot of money from that. And I think when people think about cannabis, they often think about in these same terms. This is not about the locally sort of established market, but a very extractive one. So I feel, ethical, the hope that people have that we talk to is about freedom from law enforcement, but also moving away from the margins, essentially. And I think this can only work ethical cannabis if you address those folks. And sometimes that has nothing to do with cannabis. Legal cannabis, illegal, it's about providing education for the kids, for example, because it's difficult. It means better roads into communities, all kinds of things that cannot be solved by cannabis. Anyway, so I hope that was it.
So, Brent, I actually want to reframe it a bit for you because you do the media side of it. So, what do you feel is the biggest risk in publishing on various cannabis topics and creating hope within the market or dispelling hope?
It's a multi-layered question, which I'm still searching for the answer for, which I'm still searching. Just to take a step back and to look at the concept of the ethics of hope, that feels a little bit problematic for me because it's like window shopping or it's wishful thinking. And I initially thought you said the ethics of dope. I thought, yeah. But I think that it's something that's just missing from the whole milieu, the ethical discussion should have started in the first place. I think that makes it very difficult from a media point of view. I mean, we're way beyond talking about media objectivity or balance. I mean, my view of what might be happening on Tuesday with the whatever happens would be a very different view from somebody who's being forced onto a bus or somewhere else. Look at the exact same situation with completely different realities. And I think that's one of the challenges that we have in the media spaces. How do you what is balanced reporting, never mind objective, what is fair, what is ethical? So from a Cannabis Africa point of view, I have to stay clear of words like legal because that just puts people in a difficult position. And it's a very fine line to walk between wanting to promote the industry and encourage what people are doing, and yet at the same time have the shadow of prohibition still is there, because lots of the success stories, almost all of them, in the kind of real cannabis economy that's unfolding here, are all illegal. And people are reticent to talk about their achievements or what their strategies are or how we're all working together. So it's one of those things where it's just a judgment call a day kind of thing of who I'm promoting. There is no ethical framework within which we operate other than giving somebody the right to reply and the old-fashioned rules of making sure that your facts are right or having two sources before you report of anything. But I wanted to also just question something that was said earlier. Maybe I'm sticking my head out about this, but about ethics being a relative concept. Maybe there's a gradation or it's different from people. I think one of the things that cannabis might teach us, there might be different, diverse cultures that you celebrate or buy into the plant for whatever reason. But isn't there one single ethical framework that actually underlies it all? It doesn't matter whether you're coming from the Amazon rainforest or from Boxburg, but there's something that's what the plant is teaching us is something that unites us, and some ethics maybe a starting point for that.
Yeah.
On what you're saying, Smith, when I listen to people with this word hope, coming from a kind of a liberation upbringing and reality, and then was obviously working in education and dealing with the next generations. Hope for me sits in the realm of politics. Trying to sell something, until the next election comes along, and then you can sell some more. Something that is essentially affects us all to create a new reality. Myself and Gernot are very much aligned to the new social compact with all the South Africans. In this discussion, I was saying let's put aside these labels that keep dividing us, skin color, national borders, continents. Because at the end of the day, we as operated in what people like it is the Jewish knowledge system. We don't know about land ownership. It's a foreign concept. We don't understand that how do we, one species on this planet, want to claim the very soil that we are. And you're right, my sister, in the sense of that we're trying to put this feminine energy that speaks to us in different ways, different levels and degrees of power. Very respectable. Whether you identify with the masculine or the feminine. It speaks to us in the same language universally. We need to return to stewardship.
Yes.
Ourselves as humanity. We cannot be putting our heads into the proverbial sand, looking at the rest of our family around the world, finding themselves in these man-made constructs of I'm German, I'm American, South American, African, like that's what we bring to the table as and I say this with great pride, we are hybrids. There's no one pure race here except humanity. There's no one person here that has pure blood in the next. That's a fallacy. And the fallacy that we find that is a basis in real life. When we cross these invisible lines and value each other's families, also need to my colleagues side system. You've come back home because there's an undeniable fact proven in science that we are Africa, Mother Africa. I take great pride in the fact that we are the mother city. But I come from a heavily oppressed people, colored people. And this is the label that says to me I'm a non-human being. So, 30 odd years into this first democratic age, I have to work with this. So, as above, as a colorless person to say that. Perhaps you all should be looking back at all our ancient ancestral roots because you're tied to some indigenous people. There's 317 million of us that have roots to some part of this stewardship. We have to return back to home in our minds. We have to decolonize our minds. When I say decolonization, I don't necessarily want to lose the opportunity of what colonization has brought. Because there's strengths, there's positive, there's negatives. We have to now come up with something that it's like a puzzle, man. I keep thinking of it as this masterfully designed puzzle when I look into your eyes. I see beautiful souls, I don't see your skin color, but I know that my brother over there, he was formally classified as white. My brother over there, he's formally classified as black. Yeah, I sit in the middle and it's like, shit, man, in the past, we were kept apart from having to talk to each other. Now we're in a situation in the global space where we find out, we got one home. If we leave it to these people that we call politicians, like I call them politricksters, to keep thinking that we need to sell our people hope, I don't see a very favorable future. What I do honestly believe in here, we are all going to die. That's a fact. From an IKS point of view, we are planting the seed now for the next 7 generations. So, fantastic, we're all adults here, but where's the youth?
Yeah.
Where's the young sitting at this table? What did you I took a couple of thesis, potentials, see a couple of next presidents, but on the feministic side of things, because I'm a bit tired of the story club, the speeders club.
Sausage face right here.
So, Baer's perspective on that word I was struggling for, like, it wasn't custodianship, it was actual stewardship.
Stewardship.
Go back to taking care of ourselves.
I think if we consider the Christian hegemony as well, one of the biggest mistranslations with the Bible is originally we were handed stewardship, not dominion.
Mm-hmm.
And it's through dominion that we separated ourselves from nature. Just as a side note, please do go and read Peter Singer. I think you all need it in your lives. And a little France fan in it if you feel triggered or challenged by decoloniality. Highly recommend it. Chile, Mbembe as well, please. So, Brett, I just want to finish with you on the construct of creating a hopeful ethics or the ethics of hope.
I suppose, yeah, thanks, Leela. I guess it's a dream to kind of marry to the extent that we can, at least currently in SA, what's available legally with building cultural bridges. So I suppose, like at the Mpondoland Plug project, we roll, like what we do at Harambe Solutions is we offer a solution which we sell as a bona fide defense to a charge of dealing. That's the best that we can do. And as a part of that, you have growers, however they might be in your immediate geography, they might be further out. And the reality is, why not have a human being grower in Pondoland who becomes a part of your actual community?
Mm.
So the Pondoland Plug project is very simply the attempt to plug those guys in, but not just through e-commerce, also through culture. So that these guys become, the club members, they become growing club members of these participant clubs. And in so doing, you engage in a process of cultural exchange, in a process of identifying and building bridges between these worlds. And so it's hopefully not really, it's an exercise in limiting hope as well, because on the ground, like Marlene was saying earlier, we want to actually assist people to provide commerce for themselves. So it's actually about actually doing something instead of promising something. So it's a small little pilot that we're busy with, and we're working with 20 farmers at the moment. Each of them have big families and whatnot, but these guys are being connected to their community clubs in the cities. They know their growers, they know their products, and we're actually building a connection between these people in Mpondoland and the endocannabinoid systems of their brothers and sisters in the city and vice versa. So it's small, but it's trying to build that bridge, that massive gap between culture and law in a way that there's some sort of bona fide defense for, and no more or less than that, really.
That ties into the next point I want to look at. I want to focus a bit more on harm reduction. So I find this is a term that's thrown around very loosely. I just want to define what harm reduction is. So it is a core set of philosophies or philosophical practices that aim to reduce the social, legal, and health harms associated with substance use and or any other behaviors. So I like to use the analogy of bungee jumping. If you go jump without the rope, without listening to the instructor, without the harness, you're going to be splattered. So you'll have a bit of fun and then not at all. With cannabis, we face a very interesting side with harm reduction in that we have a very arrogant portion of our community that refuses to admit that there are harms associated with cannabis use. Brother Ben's wife yesterday highlighted something very pertinent to me where she said, if somebody smokes cannabis and somebody else smells that cannabis, you could trigger a negative experience for them because they may have had a parent or a family member that may have combined it with mandrax or methaqualone for our foreigners. It's a smoked quaalude in South Africa, still very popular, introduced by good old voted Son under the old government. And basically, considering something like that for me really speaks to needing to understand the privilege with which we stand within this industry as well. For some people, cannabis is viewed as a gateway drug, and for very good reason. It's not necessarily that the substance itself is the gateway, it is the trauma that leads into that. But if that is the first substance that you find and you have poor drug education around that, there's not that much of a barrier stopping you to experiment further. And I think that is also just bearing that kind of nuance in mind that I want to move on to another question within that. So right now, in the wonderful world of cannabis, the existing market, which I just plainly refuse to call the illicit market because we were here first, the existing market is really facing mass discrimination as we see this new commercial market or commercial practice really take place. We've got fragmented liberalization of this plant globally, and through that we have fragmented ideas of how to develop this industry. South Africans who know me know that I'm very much against the misuse of legislation to tell lies to get high. That's through Section 21 fuckers, wherever you may be. So for me, that's a big thing, because basically what's happened through that is us recreational users do face a lot of discrimination. Oh, you have dirty weed, it's not tested, whatnot. It's like, bugger off, man. I've been smoking Pondu since I was 14. I'm still here. So, and if it was that poisonous, like Snooks was saying earlier, if we were killing people with it, then why do you want it? Why do you want this knowledge? Why do you want to profit from it? So the big thing is, how do we reduce the social harms of having this false dichotomy that separates the new market from the existing market? So how do we really challenge the social harms that come about with these new narratives that basically are just active discrimination against what has always been? Anyone can go first. You guys can maybe go first.
I'll just go first, which is just it's difficult because cannabis is supposedly regulated like tax or alcohol, but it's not the same, and it's a very it's a trick about how do you create rules around THC, which is opening up your minds, taking you into all sorts of places where it's not the same for everybody. And I think that is a problem of the whole world, that governments generally come from a command and control perspective. And I think this is probably the greatest challenge to regulation because of its internal inherent dynamism. You're trying to make a plant into a medicine. You're trying to change the rules of the game. And I think that almost the best way for governments to approach a harms reduction perspective, instead of trying to control it, is actually just to surrender and give it over to the private club movements who have been shown in this country already in the short time that they've been in existence to be probably the most effective educational and harms reduction mechanisms that are available in society, those that have taken themselves responsibility. And I think they're many more than we give credit for. People need to be compliant, and generally it comes with the plant. It's not the same mindset as being an alcohol retailer or wanting to sell cigarettes, but the way the government, I think, should start in the harms reduction thing is actually, first of all, engaging people who are involved in the plant, and secondly, actually just to get out of the way, because the Department of Health or are you going to, or even if you're looking at the Section 21 setup, or all the things that the design flaws that have been built into the system, I would no sooner go to Section 21 or 750 with my child to get a medical cannabis consultation over the phone, because it just feels wrong. So, but to persuade the government to surrender, it's wishful thinking. So one has to work with them, and I think the way you have to do it is the first point of harms reduction in this country is to get private clubs recognised. There should be a declaratory order for a court saying they're either legal or they're not legal, and at least then that gives us something to start mobilizing for or against. Until that stays in the back.
Just for context for our foreigners, so we had a court ruling in the High Court in 2022 that stated that social clubs are neither legal nor illegal, that it is not for the courts to change the laws, that runs to the judiciary. So although we have the Constitutional Court ruling, the only legal precedent that we have right now is that ruling. It did go to the High Court of Appeal in Bloemfontein, but they settled out of court and we didn't get a resolution on that case. So effectively, social clubs in South Africa right now can only apply a legal interpretation. I think we're quite aligned in how we understand that, right? Like well, the legal interpretation as we apply it to social clubs. So in the work that I do, for example, we use the Police Directive of 2023. We use the Concord ruling, particularly where it says that if there's no law changes, then this stands. And then, of course, we need to adapt now for incoming regulations, whenever that might happen. But it's South Africa, 7 years for privacy regulations. Don't get your hopes up, people. So just bringing in the social club perspective there, where do you think the social harms can be sort of not necessarily reduced, but maybe mitigated in terms of, this new market trying to push us to the back door again?
I think we do have to always refer back to Prince judgment currently from a legal perspective, because the Act is not yet in play and we don't love it anyway. So for right now, it's a better state of affairs, in my opinion, than once the Act actually does come into play. Not necessarily, only to the extent at least, obviously getting cannabis out of the Drugs Act is obviously all important, but just from the perspective of operating a club, because it would still be on the same legal basis on the Act. But now we get to rely directly on the Prince judgments, which I, in answering your question in a bit of a loop, the Prince judgment didn't say, I think someone said the other day, I disagree, that the cannabis privacy must be exercised in your inner sanctum. It's not true. I think the Prince judgment left it very open to say, not to say where along the continuum of privacy rights we have to exercise these private use rights to cultivate, possess and use and consume cannabis in private. So I think the scope there is to say we can exercise these rights as cultural unions, as collectives and in free association. And I think it's from within that answer, relying kind of directly on the Bill of Rights, that we also kind of can potentially address the question of how to reduce social harms. It's within, I guess, a caring club space where you can potentially. I'm not sure that we must lobby for a specific modelling and type of club space, but I definitely think we need to push back against unbridled commercialization if we are going to address social harms in a transparent way that actually welcomes everyone, no matter who you are, into the conversation. Because I think that as long as if we allow unbridled commercialization to be our end goal, right, then it's bringing what type of cannabis products, if it's a product commodity and achieving economies of scale that we are looking to achieve our ends, then we're never going to, cannabis will always be a liminal exercise, because I think we need to address the question as cannabis users, as a community, do we want to be mainstream? Or do we want to remain at the margins? If we want to remain at the margins, I'd say let's go for full-scale commercialization, because all the rest of the naysayers will have their day, will continue to do what they do. So I think to bring everyone into the conversation, I'm not sure that we need to legislate a specific model of club, Brett, per se, but I think we need to push back against unbridled commercialization to allow for safe spaces that individuate, where we can individually kind of assess our own endocannabinoid requirements. And we can't do that through unbridled commercialization. That's my view, at least in the adult use space.
I wanted to take a peek on this, but I'd like to listen as well as people.
Yes, I believe there was a question there.
Yeah.
Yes.
In a word, the answer to your question is education.
Yes.
And I believe that
Where were you
education,
all yesterday? Sorry.
that education primarily has to come from the government, right? And I know that there's a challenge. Sometimes people feel that, that government is something that's separate from us.
Yes.
In theory, that's, especially in a democracy, that shouldn't be. And especially in a situation where to combat what Brad has referred to as unbridled commercialization, government has to take a proactive role, because in South Africa, cannabis is not just about recreational usage or medicinal usage. It's about providing within the basic needs of people. And that's a government responsibility. So that's not something that we can just leave to the private sector or to the free market, because The free market has never served the people. And it's government's responsibility to serve the people. And part of that responsibility is about educating the people so as to remove the stigma that is risen around this plant. And one thing that I'm very glad for, I think I just heard you use the word drugs once or twice in your whole presentation thus far. And part of the legal ethics or the conundrum that I've got is that cannabis is just nonchalantly termed a drug. Whereas if we were to be scientific about it, as Daryl always insists that, we've got to use words properly in law, cannabis is not a drug, it's a plant. And I appreciate the fact that you guys have used the word plant, right? And because we're not part of a drug culture, right? And even a substance as innocuous as water can be harmful. If you fall in a big enough reservoir and you can't swim, that water is going to kill you, right? So there's harm in respect of so many things within society. And it's by providing people with the correct information that would allow them to make informed choices about things in life. And for that, we're going to need government's help, especially like in a proactive manner to do that. Thanks.
Sita, I'll get back to you. I just want to...
But just to touch on exactly what he's saying here, I think like when you say commercialization of the plants, I think we could look at the US as a whole of how like California did it. Big brands, cookies, think of all the big ones that came in and monetized the substance, but also monetized it in their aspect, how they wanted to do it. Cheap inputs, they grew it themselves, they brought it in, they could advertise it and slap it out. And what happened, the legacy guys, what you're looking at now, fall away because there's too much money in it. And sadly, I think us as consumers play that narrative. Who do we buy? Where do we buy? I mean, we've got, why do we have American brands in Cape Town now selling American flour? Why?
Aren't you just talking about the synthetic?
But if you see, like, if that happens, us as consumers are buying it. The reason we're buying it is why they're here making money. So we need to educate ourselves to be, hey, listen, do we rather want to go and buy from our local guys, give them the money rather than have it go up? So that touches on the education. We need to educate our people, educate guys. This is how monetizing the plant amongst ourselves makes it better for ourselves. It doesn't matter whether you're Section 21 or you're this club model or that club model or whoever. We're the ones buying the product. We support who we support. That's the big thing. Everyone's going to make their money regardless. The cat's out of the bag. We just got to educate each other to be, okay, how do I want to support myself? Do I want to buy from KwaZulu-Natal? Do I want to buy from the Eastern Cape?
Well,
because we're either going to buy it or grow it. That's us.
Let me turn the question back around on you. How receptive do you think consumers are to changing their ways?
No,
considering that consumerism is founded in convenience.
Oh, no, 100%. But most of our consumers here, we look at the young guys, he was saying exactly, there's not enough young people here. Pick up your phone, what place has thrown out advertising, what place has got specials running, who will deliver to your door. That's the change right there. Some people are like, 5 or 6 different club models.
So let me reframe it one
They
more
buy
time.
between them and they're all
And then
same but different. You see what I mean?
So would you be willing to change your consumer habits so that you can benefit legacy, or if that is a little bit more expensive for you, what are you going to make the choice? Are you willing to make the sacrifice to support this industry properly? And percentile-wise, how much of the existing consumer base do you think is willing to?
Okay, well, here's the thing. Me personally, who's someone who's grown with the plant, loved the plant for many, many years, yes, because I've also had that education around the plant. So that it touches on exactly what he said. The biggest thing is the education for the consumer. Are you literally just trying to walk into a store and get high? Then the person behind the desk might not know anything about how you work, but they're now getting a kickback from that club over there to sell this specific genetic as quick as possible, what they're pushing. Does the person, whether it's was a lady that had spoken about in the US, where the older women were going to places to try and find a release on good cannabis to have a bad experience because of a specific thing that was pushed and never go back on it. We have the same divide between the old and the young, not having the education around smoking around. Because our society now has high THC. Yes, sadly, that's been pushed and that's there. High THC is not good for you. In the general gist of it, it's not good for you. Give an 18-year-old who's never smoked, who might suffer with anxiety, a 32% THC joint or bong, what's going to happen? Do you think they're going to have a good experience to go back to it? Never. 9 times out of 10, they go the other way and they look at it in a bad light, which then paints the industry in a bad light.
Yeah.
So it's like so many points. If I put that.
I really just want to compliment our brother here. And it ties back to the youth component, like we ourselves as current people in Cape Town are different with other current people in other parts of South Africa. The biggest thing that we grapple with is the stigmatization of what taka is. Okay? A lot of what happened in the past, it was a scapegoat for crime. It was used as a get out of jail kind of card that you played when you got to court case for petty theft. You would say, like, nah, I was under the influence of taka, that's why I caused this. But to the degree of actual murder cases, really, diabolical, insightful things that where cannabis was used as a scapegoat. So the trauma, the collective trauma sitting in our various communities, you can try and quantify it, but you'll get lost in the degree of that trauma. And there's actual specialists that deal with that component. I'm very much of the proactive stance of like standing in the space as a collective. That I've come to find over this 2 days now that we are the choir. I think all of us to some degree are starting to unlock those insinuations that cannabis isn't that. But yet to us as traditional practitioners is a right active substance or how it does. So it needs to be put in the right context. I mentioned the fact that these compounded extracts, feel freely made available to our youth. It's a big concern for me as I'm a father at the end of the day. And I'm raising my own youth, and I'm aware of the impact that cannabis has. But it's all about the setting. High THC products is really about, dealing with it microscopically, like in the sense of what is the individual's needs. Because I'm telling you as a practitioner, when you're dealing with stage 4 cancer, depending on the type of cancer, there's not going to be any type of relief compared to high THC in the pain management component. So for me, the social club interface is what we always advocated on the National Cannabis Association, that these become our knowledge centers, same with our industrial hubs, the new and the spoke model, But it takes us to stand in the place and take pride in the fact that we have knowledge that our people don't have, scientific knowledge, as well as academic knowledge, And that's where I'm of the opinion, I don't even entertain the thought of cannabis being a drug. It's never been a drug. It's people this, but in the right context, yes, it is a drug. But it needs to be understood in order for it to be dispensed rightly to the right people at the right percentages, And I think that's maybe where we use the club model as an opportunity. My biggest thing is with what we saw in the CCS recently, But
sorry, I'm just looking at our time here, and I would love for this to continue, but I do want to get through some of the points as well. The 2 other hands that were up, I'll get back to you in a moment if that's okay. The last question that I do want to pose, so I would like this to be the last question, and then we can just keep discussing a little bit. So just moving to the drug policy reform side of this, as we are reforming cannabis drug policy, again, it just works into this thing that we have this schism happening where we've got this new market working against the existing market. And I would actually like to start with the 2 that were quiet just now, so Gernot and Pedro. If we consider corporate social responsibility as well as the duty of care in how we actually have our research influencing reforms, what do you think corporate social responsibility really should look like in terms of
benefit sharing and also reducing the social harms that we see happening continually?
Yeah, good question. I think it also, my answer links to some of the points you made, which are really convincing. I think corporate social responsibility by itself, I'm not an expert in business studies, so I'm not totally sure what that means. But corporate social responsibility, how I understand it, is how corporations have to sign up to some ethical codes of behaving ethically or responsible in a way. But I think by itself this doesn't, I think that there's a role for government. I think what that was mentioned here, actually the government needs to be involved. The free market by itself will not lead to any kind of equitable outcomes. You need some government involvement. It doesn't mean, I think, like the point that was made before, government and societies are not separate. We are in the same boat. And actually, seeing the South African debate over the last few years, it's actually amazing how much influence there is by activists on policy and back and forth. And I wish I could see that sometimes in the other places where I've worked in the UK or in Nigeria, for example. So I think this is really a nice way to do that. But corporate responsibility by itself, I don't think that's enough. I think you need the state to play an important role. Consumers by themselves, I don't think that's enough either, because you need the state to guide the consumer as well, because all these individual consumers are not going to make the right ethical decision by themselves. You need somebody to guide, to educate.
Sorry, it seems to be the S's and the T's that are making the sound system go mad.
Anyway, but that's the main thing. I think there is a role for all those actors, and this working together, I think it's a very nice South African specific idea.
All right, yeah, I'm gonna try to wrap this up as a scientific point of view, but also as an activist. It looks like a Brazilian accent as well. Okay. Way of solving it. And also in a perspective of a company, maybe, I don't know if in a corporation, but also in a practical way that we can use. That's the main point of an ethical discussion. It's what we can do with it in a practical way, and it crosses so many things, but mainly I think the understanding of that we are in a specific social mosaic. How do you say mosaic, right? And understanding where we're at and where we're coming from and where people are coming from and where we want to get at is highly important to communicate ourselves and go into the same direction as we want, if we want, and understand who's coming in the opposite direction that we don't want to. Myself, I was back 2 years ago. I was in a conference in Chile, and I was talking about my experience in Colombia by 2 years, where I came at an activist and started working with the grassroots movement that was the first family that risked their lives putting out a product of cannabis onto Bogota streets for the first time, making a civil disobedience illegal act movement, and that opened doors for everybody, firstly in the grassroots movement, to come and occupy this space and try to move and start to move their products. And that also came in, obviously, currents of people like big companies, but also indigenous people that are coming from the mountain that were cultivating by herb 30, 40, 50 years, that were receiving literally bombs on their heads by the U.S. government on the Plan Colombia campaign, right? So I was telling them, how did we come off of that to become one of the biggest corporate companies in Colombia that only looked to export with UGP licenses to Germany to make money out of that flower that we were trying to grade as medicinal, because we wanted to make a point that the flower and the full extract product were superior than the isolated molecule. And how did that producing and to fit into those models of quality that were, for instance, non-variable in terms of THC and CBD content, for instance, which is very difficult to produce in a normal, regular climate, weather development, variety, genetically based flower plant, whatever, even more diverse in cannabis, which is very, very dynamic. So we have to fit in. And what happened was that we became the exact same thing that we didn't want to become. And by the end of it, we were the leaser people that loved cannabis in the company, that smoked cannabis in the company, and that shared that common view that we call as well as the cultural values, which could be morality and ethics. And what happened is that we lost the company. Everybody lost the company. I was there. I felt the company was mine. I lost the company. But the owners of the company made all this process of receiving all the bullets for that, lost the business. And now they're selling little droppers on the beach to neighbors where they started in the first place. And why did that happen? And in Chile, it's happening the same thing because people are striving to economically make it. And they're looking to these models of development and they're falling into this trap. And how I was facing the question over there of how do we not fall into this trap? And my answer to that, right at the moment, was looking at our values always. And something that Paulo Freire, which is an amazing educator from Brazil, presents, well, we're saying something scientifically, or that can apply to anything, companies-based activism, is that we say where we're coming from. That translates into medical ethics as conflicts of interest, right? I cannot be here. It's my duty of ethics. If I make part of a company, that is whichever company. If I'm producing cannabis with my tribe, my people over there, and I'm talking here at the ethics panel, it's important to me to say, hey, I come from this background. I push my people to sell these products that are like this because we believe in this. And this makes it so that you don't incur an error thinking on where I'm going or if I'm going neutral or something, because neutrality doesn't exist either in science or in government or anything. So where am I coming from? I'm coming from an activist basis. I'm coming from this and this movement, and I'm pushing the whole plant abstract. I'm pushing the personal attention to endocannabinoid systems to each and every one. And that is very important when I have a company, for instance, and I'm speaking to people where I can be illegitimatized, not by law, but because I have this kind of value, but what I do is different than what I'm saying I'm doing. And this takes credit out of our legitimacy. And so it's a battle of legitimacy by the end of the day. And making clear where we're coming from, where our values are, make it so that we can talk to different valued people and maybe even get into a common ground, a common point. And so it's urgently that we companies, for instance, they say when you start your company, that's why you first thing you do mission, your vision, and then your values, because you're always going to remit to them backwards. Hey, I'm doing this because this is my values. So it's important for us as to have a unified standpoint, culturally based, that could be kind of universal, but respecting the local, because that's a debate in bioethics. So how do you, what do we do universal or do we do particular? Just to finish, I'm right there.
Sorry.
We base practice, to try to give some tool here, we base it upon our own culture, which is the cannabis culture, that is based upon a global culture. So we reivindicate that as a global culture and understand its values and replicate its values. It's important for us to understand us as a whole and push the type of development that we want. So legitimacy comes out of that because people don't buy with their money. They buy, cookies are not the cheapest brand there is. They buy it with emotions. Right? So we involve people in that emotions. The way we do that is by ethics. People are alone. There's a loneliness, a problem, epidemic going on. So we embrace, and that's by
attending to each and every one, right? But we have to legitimize that, and that goes by economy as well. So we need to legitimize the product. So that's why we make methodology and put the science in to prove that we have the legitimacy and the chemistry standpoint, but we don't forget the ethics and the culture. That's I think it's the mixture that we need.
Thank you very much for that. Always getting in trouble. Tia told me that there's lunch downstairs, we're late for a warm buffet. If anybody would just like to hang back a little bit, Sita, you still had a question and the gentleman at the back, so I would like to hear what you said, but those of you who would like to go eat, please do feel free to leave.
It's just very short. I think the point of having ethical is, I think, very deep to have it in an hour. I think the discussion must be, but I would appreciate that we have to look ethical. It's first an attitude, but it's also on a full role. And it starts with respect of speaking, to listen to others, not only to be the only speaker, but the other one is also that's the attitude. I understand nostalgia, but I think it's a dangerous thing. And always to look something for which should be somewhere in the past. We have to look forward. This is change, and change brought us forward. And I think to talk to each other is a wonderful thing, but I think it is sometimes the thing is too big.
Yes.
So
that's exactly the problem that we discussed when we got together for this. So you're very right in that. It is way too complex.